What happens when a group of men target the wrong black woman, thinking no one will care? This is the incredible story of one brave black woman and her fiercely loyal dog, who stood together against hate and violence. From a terrifying confrontation to a powerful courtroom showdown, watch as justice is served and the underestimated find their strength. You won't believe how it all unfolds. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the towering oaks lining the quiet suburban street. Mrs. Eleanor Davis adjusted her sun hat, the silver locket around her neck glinting as she clasped Duke's leash. The Rottweiler, a broad and muscular dog with a glossy coat, trotted beside her, ears perked and steps confident. This was their daily ritual, an afternoon walk through the neighborhood that had been her home for over 40 years. The town had its quirks, its moments of warmth and discomfort, but Eleanor remained steadfast in her pride. The locket and bracelet she wore carried memories of her late husband, Samuel. They weren't lavish, but they were hers, and she wore them like a badge of her life's legacy. "Ready, boy?" Eleanor asked, her voice light as Duke wagged his tail in response. The pair strolled past trimmed lawns and picket fences, nodding at the occasional passerby. Eleanor felt the sting of stares sometimes, lingering gazes that hinted at silent judgments, but she held her head high. It was a good day, she thought, ignoring the distant hum of a truck that seemed to linger too long behind her. Turning onto Maple Avenue, she felt Duke tense slightly. His ears twitched, his posture growing alert. Eleanor glanced back, noticing a pickup truck slowing to a crawl a few houses down. 4 men, all young and broad-shouldered, leaned out of the windows. Their laughter carried across the quiet street, harsh and grating. "Just keep walking," Eleanor whispered to herself, gripping Duke's leash more tightly. He let out a low growl, as if sensing her unease. "Nice dog!" one of the men shouted, his tone laced with mockery. Eleanor didn't respond, keeping her pace steady. The truck stopped abruptly, and the men climbed out. "Afternoon, ma'am," the tallest of the group called out, his grin as cold as his voice. The others flanked him, their expressions a mixture of amusement and menace. "Nice jewelry you got there," another added, nodding toward her necklace. Eleanor's heart quickened, but she didn't stop walking. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" she replied evenly, her voice steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. Duke moved closer, his growl growing louder. The men didn't flinch, and Eleanor's walk turned into a slow, calculated march toward safety. "Where you headed so fast?" one of them jeered, stepping in front of her path. Eleanor paused, gripping Duke's leash tightly. "Just taking a walk," she said, her tone calm but firm. Behind her, the sun dipped slightly lower, casting long shadows on the street. Eleanor didn't flinch, her hand steady on Duke's leash. The men's laughter rang in her ears, grating and venomous, but she refused to look away. Duke growled again, his powerful body tense, ready to spring if needed. The tallest man leaned in closer, his face a mask of mocking politeness. "We're just admiring, that's all," he said, his eyes darting to the glinting necklace around her throat. "Don't get all defensive, ma'am. Ain't no harm in appreciating fine jewelry." "Admire it from a distance," Eleanor replied sharply, taking a deliberate step forward. Duke moved with her, his growl deepening. The man blocking her path folded his arms, smirking. "Feisty for an old lady, aren't you? What are you so scared of? Us? Or your dog here losing his nerve?" Duke barked suddenly, a sharp, commanding sound that made the group flinch. Eleanor didn't need to look at her dog to know he was ready. His loyalty was unwavering, and it gave her the strength to face them. "You should listen to him," Eleanor said calmly. "He's got better judgment than you." The red-faced man scoffed, stepping closer with a swagger. "Look, we ain't here to hurt you, unless you make us. Just hand over the necklace, maybe the bracelet too, and we'll be out of your hair." "Out of my hair?" Eleanor's voice sharpened, her grip on Duke's leash tightening. "What makes you think you can threaten me like this and walk away?" "Because no one cares," another man interjected, his voice laced with venom. "You're just some old black lady. You think anyone's going to give a damn about what happens to you in this country? Please. Eleanor's expression didn't falter, but her chest tightened at the hateful words. She knew the undercurrents of their town, the prejudice that emboldened men like these, and the belief that her life was somehow worth less, but she wasn't about to show weakness. You picked the wrong woman to mess with, Eleanor said firmly. And if you don't back off, you're going to regret it. The tallest man laughed, shaking his head. Regret it? Lady, we're giving you a chance here. Just hand over the goods, and no one gets hurt. You wouldn't want this to get messy. Duke barked again, louder this time, cutting off the man's words. His muscles coiled as if ready to pounce, his teeth bared in warning. The tension in the air grew thicker, the men exchanging uneasy glances even as they tried to maintain their bravado. The man closest to Duke stepped forward hesitantly, pointing at the dog. That mutt's all bark. No bite. You can't scare us with your furry little bodyguard. Try me, Eleanor said coldly. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. I promise you, he's not bluffing, the red-faced man snorted, trying to laugh off the moment. Yeah, right. What's he gonna do? Drool us to death? Eleanor took a step forward, her voice dropping to a sharp edge. He'll do whatever it takes to protect me, and you'll wish you had listened. For a brief moment, the group hesitated. Duke's growls seemed to fill the street, echoing off the houses around them. But the red-faced man shook his head, turning to his companions. She's full of it. Let's just take what we came for. The tallest man nodded, stepping closer. Fine. You don't want to cooperate? Guess we'll have to take it the hard way. The four of them began to spread out, moving to encircle Eleanor. She stepped back, keeping Duke close, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't outmatch them physically, but she also knew Duke was more than capable of holding his own. You're making a mistake, Eleanor warned, her voice unwavering. Walk away now, while you still can. The tallest man sneered. Lady, you talk a big game for someone with no backup. Who says I'm alone? Eleanor countered, her eyes flicking to the neighbor's security camera perched above a nearby garage. She didn't know if it was recording, but she hoped the subtle gesture would give them pause. The men followed her gaze but quickly dismissed it. The red-faced man rolled his eyes. Yeah, someone's always watching. Save it. No one's coming to help you. One of the men darted forward, testing Duke's resolve. The dog barked ferociously, snapping his jaws just inches from the man's outstretched hand. The would-be attacker stumbled back, cursing under his breath. Damn, dog, he shouted. This ain't worth it. Yes, it is, the tallest man snapped. She's bluffing. That mutt can't take all of us. Eleanor held her ground, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. He won't have to. The street seemed to hold its breath as the men circled closer, their taunts growing sharper, their movements more deliberate. Duke's growls were unrelenting now, a steady, menacing vibration that echoed in the heavy afternoon air. Eleanor stood her ground, her pulse racing, but her gaze steady. Last chance, the tallest man said, his voice cold and sharp. Give us the damn necklace, or we'll take it. Your mutt can't stop all of us. Eleanor glanced down at Duke, his lips pulled back to reveal glistening teeth. You think you're the first cowards to try and take what doesn't belong to them? Go ahead, she said coolly. See how that works out for you. The challenge was enough to push the men over the edge. The red-faced man lunged first, aiming for Eleanor's arm. Duke sprang forward like a tightly wound spring released, his bark piercing and ferocious. His teeth sank into the man's sleeve before he could reach her, yanking him backward with a force that sent him sprawling onto the pavement. The man screamed, clutching his arm as he tried to kick Duke away. Get him off me! Get this damn dog off me! He bellowed, his voice laced with pain and fear. Call him off! One of the others shouted, his earlier bravado crumbling. Eleanor didn't flinch. I warned you, she said evenly, her grip on Duke's leash firm. This is on you, the tallest man cursed under his breath and motioned for one of the others to help. Get the dog off him, he barked, but none of them dared move closer. Duke released his grip on the red-faced man and stood over him, snarling, his hackles raised like a lion guarding its territory. "Come on, we've got numbers," one of the men urged, though his voice shook. "It's just a dog." "Just a dog?" Eleanor said sharply, her voice cutting through the panic. "He's more loyal and capable than any of you." Another man darted forward, this time trying to grab Duke's leash. Duke spun quickly, his powerful jaws snapping dangerously close to the man's hand. The would-be attacker recoiled, stumbling back into his companions. "You're all pathetic," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "4 grown men, and you can't even handle one old lady and her dog." The tallest man's face twisted in anger. "Enough of this!" he shouted, his temper snapping. He reached for Eleanor directly, grabbing at the chain around her neck. Before he could tug it free, Duke lunged again, this time aiming higher. His teeth latched onto the man's jacket, shaking him violently. "Stop! Stop!" the man screamed, flailing as he tried to shove Duke away. His companions hesitated, clearly torn between helping and running. The red-faced man, still clutching his injured arm, snarled from the ground. "She's not worth this. Let's just leave." But the tallest man wasn't ready to back down. "No way! Not until we get what we came for." His words were defiant, but the desperation in his tone was impossible to miss. Eleanor stood rooted, her hand still gripping Duke's leash. Her eyes swept the scene, landing briefly on the security camera across the street. She knew it was capturing every second, every desperate motion, every hateful word. That camera was her witness, and it gave her the strength to speak again. "Leave now," she said firmly, her voice unyielding, "and maybe you'll walk away with what little dignity you have left." "You think you're in control here?" Another man sneered, though his voice trembled. "We're not scared of you. Then why are you still standing there?" Eleanor shot back, her tone icy. "You had every chance to walk away, and you chose this instead." The tallest man finally shoved Duke off and staggered back, his face red with fury and embarrassment. "We're not leaving empty-handed," he snarled, spitting onto the pavement. "You'll regret this." Duke barked again, louder this time, advancing a step toward the men. His sheer size and unrelenting aggression made them falter once more. The red-faced man scrambled to his feet, his injured arm hanging limply at his side. He looked to his companions, but none of them met his gaze. "This is a waste of time," one muttered, his voice low and shaky. The tallest man glared at him. "Shut up. We're not done." "Actually, you are," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. She took a deliberate step forward, Duke by her side, both of them radiating an unyielding presence that seemed to make the men shrink. "Last warning," she said. "Leave now, or I won't call Duke off next time." The group hesitated, their bravado wavering as their gazes darted between the ferocious dog and the resolute woman who refused to back down. The air was thick with tension, every second feeling like an eternity, but no one moved. Not yet. The men exchanged tense, uncertain glances, their earlier confidence unraveling in the face of Duke's relentless growls and Eleanor's calm defiance. Yet, despite the fear flickering in their eyes, the tallest man's pride refused to let him back down. He squared his shoulders and turned to his group, his voice dripping with venom. "We're not letting her win," he growled. "It's 4 of us, and 1 dog. She can't stop all of us." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her hand firm on Duke's leash. "4 of you? Seems like my dog's already outmatched you." Her words cut deep, and the red-faced man cursed under his breath, clutching his injured arm. "Let's just take her stuff and go. I'm not sticking around to get bit again." "She's bluffing," the tallest man snapped, stepping closer. "She can't control that dog forever." Duke barked sharply, cutting through the heavy tension like a knife. The sound echoed off the quiet suburban homes, startling the men once more. But this time, the tallest man lunged without warning, his hands outstretched toward Eleanor's necklace. The sudden movement ignited chaos. Duke surged forward, breaking Eleanor's steady grip on the leash. The dog's powerful body collided with the man, knocking him to the ground with a resounding thud. His scream pierced the air as Duke pinned him, growling ferociously, his teeth bared inches from the man's face. "Help me!" the man shouted, his voice cracking. He struggled against Duke's weight, his bravado entirely gone. "Get him off!" But the others hesitated, their courage evaporating as they watched their leader grapple with the massive dog. One man took a step forward, but Duke snarled, snapping his teeth in a warning that froze him in his tracks. "Not so brave now, are you?" Eleanor said coldly, standing tall despite her racing heart. "Shut up!" one of the others yelled, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound of his shout was quickly drowned out by something else, a distant wailing sound growing louder with every passing second. Sirens. The men's heads whipped around, the telltale sound of police sirens sending a ripple of panic through the group. One of them swore loudly, his face paling. "Cops! We gotta go." "Not without him!" another protested, pointing to the man pinned under Duke. The tallest man thrashed beneath Duke's unyielding grip, his face contorted in fear. "Get me out of here!" he screamed, but none of the others moved. Eleanor crossed her arms, her expression stern. "Looks like your friends are smarter than you. They're about to run and leave you to deal with the consequences." The red-faced man backed away slowly, his injured arm hanging uselessly at his side. "Screw this! I'm not going to jail!" He turned and bolted toward the truck, the others quickly following suit. "Wait! Don't leave me!" the leader screamed, his voice filled with desperation. But the other men didn't look back, scrambling into the truck and peeling out in a screech of tires. The sound of the sirens grew louder, echoing down the street as the truck disappeared around the corner. Eleanor stepped forward cautiously, her voice steady but commanding. "Duke, hold!" The dog obeyed, his growls subsiding slightly but his stance firm. He kept the man pinned, his teeth just inches from the man's throat. The leader's chest heaved as he stared up at Duke, his earlier arrogance replaced by sheer terror. "You don't understand," the man stammered, his voice shaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We just—" Eleanor cut him off, her tone razor-sharp. "You just— what? Thought you'd rob an old lady because you thought no one would care? Thought no one would stop you?" She shook her head, her eyes cold. "You're going to regret every choice you made today." Red and blue lights washed over the street as a police cruiser came to a stop nearby. Officer James Carter stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as he approached cautiously. "Mrs. Davis, are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, her hand steady on Duke's leash. "We're fine, Officer Carter. My Duke here stopped this one before he could do more damage." The officer's gaze shifted to the man pinned under Duke, his eyes narrowing. "I see that. Good work, Duke." He crouched slightly, his voice firm. "Stay still, buddy. Don't make this worse for yourself." The man didn't dare move, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Get this dog off me," he whimpered. Eleanor's expression didn't soften. "Not until you're cuffed and in the back of that car." Officer Carter moved quickly, securing the man's hands behind his back. "Okay, Mrs. Davis. You can call him off now." "Duke, release!" Eleanor commanded. Duke stepped back immediately, his posture still alert as he returned to her side. She knelt beside him, scratching his ears as she murmured, "Good boy. You did good." The man groaned as Officer Carter hauled him to his feet. "Where are your friends?" the officer asked. The man's gaze dropped to the pavement, his voice trembling. "They left me." "Smart of them," Officer Carter muttered, glancing at Eleanor. "We'll handle it from here. You sure you're okay?" Eleanor stood tall, her hand resting on Duke's head. "We're okay now, but I want to make sure this doesn't happen again." "It won't," Carter promised, leading the man to the cruiser. "Not if I have anything to say about it." As the door slammed shut, Eleanor exhaled deeply, her resolve unshaken. Duke wagged his tail, leaning into her side. She gave him a small smile. "Let's go home, boy." Eleanor stood on the sidewalk in front of her house, watching as the last police cruiser drove away. The street was quiet again, but the tension in the air was palpable. Duke sat at her feet, his ears perked as he scanned the surroundings, still on high alert. She gave him a reassuring pat on the head, though her own nerves were far from calm. Her thoughts swirled as she replayed the confrontation. The men's hateful words echoed in her mind, their entitlement and venom fueling her resolve. She took a deep breath, readying herself for what she knew was coming next. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her reverie. Pulling it out, she saw Officer Carter's name on the screen. "Mrs. Davis," his steady voice greeted her. "I wanted to let you know we've got the man your dog stopped in custody. We'll need you to come down to the station to give a full statement." Eleanor straightened, her voice firm. "Of course, I want to see this through." A short time later, Eleanor stepped into the police station, the bustling atmosphere contrasting sharply with the quiet resolve she carried. Duke remained at home, resting after his heroics, but she felt his presence like a steadying anchor. Officer Carter greeted her at the front desk and led her down a corridor to a small interview room. "Thanks for coming in," Carter said, gesturing to a chair. He set a clipboard on the table and sat across from her. "We've got Brian Tanner in holding. The man Duke stopped. He's being less than cooperative, but I thought you might like to have a word with him before we go through your statement." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You're saying I can talk to him?" Carter nodded. "Within reason. Sometimes hearing from the victim can shake things up. Just know I'll be right there." Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then squared her shoulders. "Take me to him." A guard escorted Eleanor into the holding area, where a steel door opened to reveal a small room with a table and 2 chairs. Brian Tanner sat slouched in one of them, his face pale and his arm in a hastily bandaged sling. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced with a mixture of irritation and unease. Eleanor stepped inside, her heels clicking against the floor. She met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "Brian Tanner," she said, her voice steady. "So that's your name." Brian leaned back in his chair, his lips twisting into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "What's it to you, lady?" Eleanor took the seat across from him, folding her hands neatly on the table. "You and your friends decided to attack me in the middle of the day. I think I have the right to know who thought they could get away with it." Brian scoffed, his smirk fading slightly. "Attack? We didn't attack you. We just wanted what you had. You didn't have to make it a big deal." "A big deal?" Eleanor's voice sharpened, and she leaned forward. "You and your friends stalked me, threatened me, and tried to rob me. That dog of mine saved you from a worse fate, Mr. Tanner. If you had gotten what you wanted, would it have stopped there?" Brian's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "You thought no one would care," Eleanor continued, her tone cutting. "You thought I'd be easy prey, because I'm old and black, and you figured no one would stand up for me. Isn't that right?" Brian's smirk vanished entirely. He looked away, his fingers tapping anxiously against the table. "I don't have to listen to this," he muttered. Eleanor leaned back, her expression cold. "No, you don't. But you'll listen to the judge when this all goes to trial. And trust me, they're going to hear every detail. The security camera caught everything. There's no hiding from what you and your friends did." Brian shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders slumping. "They ran," he said bitterly. "They left me there." "Cowards," Eleanor said bluntly. "But you followed them. You chose this. Now you get to live with the consequences." Brian shot her a glare, but it lacked the fire he had shown earlier. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Eleanor replied. "I know you thought you were untouchable. I know you thought you could intimidate me. But let me tell you something, Mr. Tanner. You've got nothing I'm afraid of." Before Brian could respond, the door opened, and Officer Carter stepped inside. "That's enough," he said, nodding toward Eleanor. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis. I think we've got what we need." Eleanor stood, her gaze lingering on Brian for a moment longer. "You should start thinking about how you got here, Mr. Tanner, because this is only the beginning of your reckoning." With that, she left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Carter followed her back to the interview room, where she sat down once more to complete her statement. Her mind remained steady, her resolve as strong as ever. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table the next morning, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The events of the previous day lingered in her mind, vivid and unshakable. Duke lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, occasionally glancing up at her as if sensing her lingering tension. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she reached for it, recognizing Officer Carter's number. "Good morning, Mrs. Davis," his voice greeted her, steady and reassuring. "I thought you'd like to know. 2 more of the men from yesterday have been arrested." Eleanor exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the phone. "That's good to hear. Where did you find them?" "Turns out they weren't too far," Carter replied. "One of them was holed up at a relative's house, the other hiding in plain sight. It didn't take long to track them down once we put out the warrants. Brian Tanner's cooperation, or lack of it, didn't matter much after we pulled the security footage. The video was clear enough for us to identify the whole group." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "What about the last one? The driver? We're closing in on him," Carter assured her. "It's only a matter of time. Once we have him, the DA will move forward with the charges." Eleanor set her coffee down, staring out the window at the quiet street. "Good. They need to answer for what they did." "They will," Carter said firmly. "But I wanted to give you a heads up about something else. The arrests are making waves. Local media picked up the story, and it's already causing some reactions." "Reactions?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharpening. "There's a lot of talk," Carter admitted. "Most of it's supportive, but you know how these things go. Some folks are already trying to spin this, saying it's not as bad as it looks, or that the men didn't mean any harm. The usual nonsense." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Let them talk. The truth is on our side." Later that afternoon, Eleanor found herself at the grocery store. As she moved down the aisles, she noticed the glances, some curious, some sympathetic, and a few pointed stares that carried thinly veiled judgment. A woman she recognized from the neighborhood stopped her near the produce section. "Eleanor, I heard about what happened," the woman said, her voice hushed but insistent. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, thank you," Eleanor replied, her tone polite but measured. "Duke and I handled it." The woman nodded, but her expression wavered. "It's just such a shame, isn't it? Young men these days, they just don't think." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, they don't. But this wasn't a matter of not thinking. They knew exactly what they were doing." The woman flinched at Eleanor's sharp tone, but quickly recovered, offering a tight smile before excusing herself. Eleanor watched her retreat, a mix of frustration and determination swirling within her. That evening, Eleanor turned on the television, flipping through channels until she landed on the local news. The reporter stood in front of the police station, a somber expression on her face as she recounted the incident. "The arrests of 2 additional suspects today bring the total to 3. The suspects are accused of attempting to rob Mrs. Eleanor Davis, a retired teacher, during her afternoon walk. The confrontation, which was partially captured on a neighbor's security camera, has sparked both outrage and debate within the community." The footage played briefly, showing the men closing in on Eleanor and Duke's fierce intervention. The sight of Duke pinning Brian Tanner to the ground drew a faint smile from Eleanor, though it quickly faded as the reporter continued. "While many in the community have expressed support for Mrs. Davis, others have questioned the severity of the charges, claiming the suspects were simply misguided, and that the situation escalated unnecessarily." Eleanor's hands curled into fists. "Misguided," she muttered under her breath. "They attacked me in broad daylight, and they call that misguided?" The next segment shifted to interviews with community members. A younger woman spoke passionately. "What happened to Mrs. Davis was unacceptable. No one should feel unsafe walking in their own neighborhood." Then came a middle-aged man, his expression skeptical. "I mean, yeah, they shouldn't have done it. But people are acting like these guys are hardened criminals. It's not like they hurt anyone." Eleanor turned off the television, her frustration boiling over. She stood and began pacing the living room, her thoughts racing. The audacity of people excusing such blatant violence was infuriating. She had fought to protect herself and Duke, and now she had to contend with people diminishing her experience. Duke sat up, his eyes following her movements. She paused, kneeling beside him and stroking his fur. "They think they can talk their way out of this, boy," she said softly. "But they're wrong. They picked the wrong woman to mess with." The phone rang again, breaking the silence. Eleanor answered, her tone brisk. "Hello? Mrs. Davis, it's Jessica Nguyen," the voice on the other end said. "I've been assigned as the prosecutor for your case." Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you for calling, Miss Nguyen. I want to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." "Trust me, it won't," Jessica replied. "The evidence is strong, and we're pursuing the maximum penalties. I'll keep you updated as we prepare for the arraignment." Eleanor nodded, a small but determined smile forming. "Good, I'll be ready." As she hung up, she sat back in her chair, Duke curling up at her feet once more. The fight for justice wasn't over, but Eleanor knew she had the strength to see it through. Eleanor sat across from Jessica Nguyen, the young prosecutor assigned to her case. The two women were seated in a small conference room at the district attorney's office, papers and folders spread out between them. Jessica, her expression focused but kind, pointed to a timeline laid out on the table. "The arraignment is set for next week," Jessica explained. "We'll be presenting the charges against the three men already in custody: Brian Tanner, James Foley, and Kyle Mercer. But as of now, the fourth suspect, the driver, is still at large." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "How can he still be missing? Surely someone knows where he is." Jessica nodded, her tone measured. "We're pursuing every lead. The security footage gave us a clear image of his face, and we've circulated his information statewide. It's only a matter of time before he slips up." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "He won't stay hidden forever. People like him think they're invincible until they aren't." Jessica smiled faintly. "I like your confidence, Mrs. Davis. In the meantime, we'll focus on preparing for the trial. Your testimony, along with the footage, and Officer Carter's report, will form the backbone of the case." Eleanor nodded. "I'll be ready. These men need to be held accountable, not just for what they did to me, but for thinking they could get away with it." Later that afternoon, Eleanor decided to take Duke for a walk in the park, a welcome reprieve from the mounting tension of the case. The late autumn air was crisp, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot provided a soothing rhythm as she strolled along the path. Duke trotted happily beside her, his tail wagging as he sniffed at every tree and bush. The park was quiet, with only a few other people scattered about. Eleanor paused at a bench, letting Duke explore a patch of grass nearby. She watched him fondly, her thoughts momentarily drifting away from the trial. But Duke's behavior suddenly changed. His body stiffened, and his ears perked up as he sniffed the air with sharp, deliberate motions. A low growl rumbled in his throat, and he turned toward a cluster of trees on the far side of the park. "Duke?" Eleanor called, her voice tinged with concern. "What is it, boy?" The dog didn't respond, instead pulling at his leash with a strength that caught her off guard. She followed his lead, her heart quickening as he led her toward the trees. The closer they got, the more intense Duke's growls became. Emerging from the shadows of the trees was a man, his face partially obscured by a hoodie. He froze when he saw Eleanor and Duke, his eyes darting around as if calculating his chances of escape. Eleanor's eyes widened in recognition. "It's him," she whispered. "The driver, the final member of the group." The man hesitated for only a moment before breaking into a sprint, weaving through the trees in a desperate attempt to flee. But Duke was faster. With a sharp bark, he surged forward, pulling the leash from Eleanor's hands as he tore after the man. "Duke, stop him!" Eleanor called, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Duke closed the distance in seconds, leaping onto the man and knocking him to the ground. The man let out a panicked shout as he struggled beneath the dog's weight, but Duke held firm, his growls loud and commanding. Eleanor hurried to the scene, her chest heaving from the rush. She pulled out her phone, quickly dialing 911. "This is Eleanor Davis," she told the dispatcher, her voice steady. "I've found the fourth suspect from the robbery. My dog has him pinned in Eastwood Park. Send officers immediately." The man squirmed beneath Duke, his voice desperate. Get him off me! I didn't do anything. Eleanor's expression hardened as she stepped closer. You did plenty. And now you'll face the consequences. Within minutes, the sound of sirens echoed through the park. A patrol car pulled up near the trail, and two officers approached quickly, their hands hovering near their holsters. They paused briefly, taking in the sight of Duke standing over the man. Eleanor raised a hand, her voice calm. It's him. Duke's holding him. One of the officers stepped forward cautiously. Ma'am, can you call off your dog so we can take him into custody? Eleanor knelt beside Duke, her hand on his head. Duke, release, she commanded firmly. The dog stepped back immediately, his eyes still locked on the man as the officers moved in to cuff him. The man protested weakly as he was hauled to his feet. It wasn't my idea. It was Tanner's plan. I was just the driver. Save it for the judge, one of the officers said, leading him to the patrol car. Eleanor watched as the man was loaded into the back seat, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and triumph. She looked down at Duke, who wagged his tail and nuzzled her hand. Good boy, she murmured. You did it again. The officers approached her, one of them tipping his hat. Thanks to you and your dog, we've got the whole crew now. They'll all be facing justice. Eleanor smiled faintly, her hand resting on Duke's head. That's all I wanted. As the patrol car drove away, Eleanor turned back toward the park's path, her steps steady and sure. Duke walked beside her, his tail wagging confidently. The fight wasn't over yet, but Eleanor knew she'd already won a major battle. Eleanor sat once again in the familiar interview room at the police station, Duke resting at her feet. The capture of the final suspect, Michael Mick Lewis, had brought her a measure of relief. But questions lingered in her mind. Why had he been hiding in the park, so close to where the incident had occurred? She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that there was more to his story. Jessica Nguyen entered the room, her expression a mix of satisfaction and determination. She set her files on the table, giving Eleanor a nod. Good to see you again, Mrs. Davis. Thanks for coming in. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Have they questioned him yet? Mick Lewis? I want to know why he was in that park. Jessica sat down and folded her hands over the files. He's talked a little, mostly trying to downplay his role. Officer Carter just finished questioning him. Let me bring him in so you can hear for yourself. Minutes later, the door opened, and Mick was escorted in, his hands cuffed. His hoodie was gone, revealing a thin man with nervous eyes and a pale complexion. He glanced at Eleanor, then quickly looked away, his shoulders hunched as he was guided into the chair across from her. Eleanor's gaze was steady. So, Mr. Lewis, she began, her voice sharp but calm, you were the last one caught, and in the same neighborhood where it all happened. Care to explain? Mick hesitated, his gaze darting to Jessica and then to the officers standing by the door. I didn't know you'd be there, he stammered. I wasn't trying to find you. I was just hiding. Hiding? Eleanor raised an eyebrow. In plain sight? That doesn't sound like a very smart move. Mick squirmed in his chair. I didn't have anywhere else to go. My buddies bailed on me, left me with nothing. I figured the park was quiet enough to lay low. Didn't think anyone would notice me. You thought wrong, Eleanor replied firmly. And what about that day? Why were you involved at all? Mick sighed, leaning back in his chair. Tanner told me it'd be easy money. He said we'd just scare some old lady and grab some jewelry. No one was supposed to get hurt. I was just the driver. I didn't touch you. That's supposed to make it better. Eleanor's voice rose slightly, her eyes narrowing. You sat there, ready to speed away with whatever they stole. And you think that absolves you? Mick's head dropped, and he muttered, I didn't think it'd go that far. Jessica stepped in, her tone firm. But you stayed in that truck and drove them to the scene, Mr. Lewis. You were a willing participant, and that makes you just as guilty as the others. Mick's shoulders slumped. Look, I messed up. I get it. But Tanner's the one who planned it all. He was the one who said no one would care about her. About you, he added, glancing hesitantly at Eleanor. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. He thought wrong, and so did you. You all underestimated me, and now you're here. Mick swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I didn't want to end up here." Jessica leaned forward, her expression sharp. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to target someone you thought couldn't fight back." After Mick was escorted out of the room, Eleanor turned to Jessica. "So, he was just hiding in the park? Waiting for this to blow over?" Jessica nodded. "That's his story. Frankly, it lines up. He doesn't seem bright enough to have a long-term plan, but that doesn't change the fact that he was a part of this." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers brushing Duke's head as he rested at her feet. "He seemed scared, probably because he's realizing his life is about to change forever." Jessica smiled faintly. "As it should, and thanks to your quick thinking and Duke's sharp nose, we've got all four of them. That's going to make the trial much stronger." "What happens next?" Eleanor asked. Jessica gathered her files, her expression growing serious. "Now, we prepare for the trial. We'll present the charges, call witnesses, and lay out all the evidence. Their lawyers will try to spin the narrative, maybe even try to blame each other. But with the footage, your testimony, and everything else, it's an airtight case." Eleanor nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Good. Because they deserve everything coming to them." Jessica smiled. "I couldn't agree more. I'll be in touch soon with the trial details. For now, get some rest. You've already done more than enough." That evening, Eleanor returned home, her thoughts heavy with the day's events. She sat on the porch with Duke, the cool evening breeze brushing against her face. The neighborhood was quiet, the same calm that had been so rudely interrupted just days before. She reached down to scratch Duke behind the ears, her voice soft but firm. "You did good again today, boy," she said. "One more step toward justice." Duke wagged his tail, his loyalty as unshakable as her determination. The trial loomed ahead, but Eleanor felt ready. She had faced fear, prejudice, and violence head-on, and she wouldn't stop until justice was fully served. The courtroom was alive with tension as Eleanor stepped inside, the weight of the trial pressing on her shoulders. She adjusted her jacket and took a steadying breath, feeling Duke's absence keenly. Her loyal companion was home, resting after his role in the ordeal, but she carried his bravery with her. Today was about justice. The defendants sat at the defense table, their faces a mixture of defiance and unease. Brian Tanner, the ringleader, leaned back in his chair, a smug tilt to his chin, while James Foley and Kyle Mercer whispered nervously. Michael "Mick" Lewis, at the far end, kept his gaze fixed on the table, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Eleanor's eyes met Jessica Nguyen's across the courtroom. The prosecutor was arranging her files with precision, her movements calm but purposeful. She gave Eleanor a small nod of encouragement before rising and stepping toward the jury. Jessica's voice filled the room, clear and commanding. She painted a vivid picture of the events, describing how four men had targeted Eleanor, thinking she was vulnerable, thinking no one would care. She explained how they had underestimated her resolve and the fierce loyalty of her dog. The evidence, she promised, would leave no doubt about their intent and actions. Eleanor sat quietly, listening as Jessica's words flowed seamlessly, laying the groundwork for the trial. When it was her turn to testify, she walked to the stand with her head held high. She adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. Eleanor recounted the events with unwavering clarity. She spoke about her afternoon walk, how she noticed the truck slowing, how the men's taunts escalated into threats. Her voice remained steady, even as she described the moment Duke leapt to defend her. She didn't embellish. The truth was powerful enough on its own. When Jessica asked her what the men had said to her, Eleanor's expression hardened. She repeated their words verbatim. How they thought no one would care what happened to her, how they believed she was an easy target. Her words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing on everyone in the room. The defense attorneys tried to chip away at her testimony. They framed their questions carefully, suggesting the defendants had been misguided rather than malicious. One asked whether Brian Tanner truly intended to harm her, or if he had just wanted to scare her. Eleanor didn't flinch. She replied firmly that Tanner had lunged at her, trying to rip her necklace from her neck. It wasn't about scaring her, she said, but about taking what he wanted without regard for her. Another attorney tried to suggest that Duke's actions had escalated the situation unnecessarily. Eleanor's sharp gaze pinned him in place as she reminded the court that Duke had acted in defense of her and himself, responding to a direct threat. She added that if the men had left when warned, Duke wouldn't have had to intervene. As she stepped down from the stand, Jessica gave her an approving look. Eleanor returned to her seat, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. Officer James Carter took the stand next, his testimony providing the factual backbone of the case. He described the initial 911 call, the scene when he arrived, and the subsequent arrest of Brian Tanner. His words were precise and professional, leaving little room for interpretation. The highlight of Carter's testimony was the security footage. The video played on a large screen, showing the confrontation in stark detail. The jury watched as the truck slowed. The men stepped out, and the situation escalated. The footage captured the aggression of the defendants, the ferocity of Duke's defense, and Eleanor's composed defiance. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the video ended, the silence that followed heavy with understanding. When Michael "Mick" Lewis took the stand, his demeanor was markedly different from his co-defendants. Having agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence, he avoided looking at Tanner and the others. His voice was shaky as he described how Tanner had planned the robbery, how he had assured them it would be easy money. Mick admitted he had driven the truck and stayed in it during the confrontation, claiming he hadn't thought it would escalate the way it did. Jessica pressed him on why he had participated at all. Mick hesitated before replying that Tanner had convinced them no one would care about the victim, that it was a low-risk job. His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the callousness that had driven their actions. Eleanor watched the jury closely, noting their reactions. Some looked angry, others pensive, but all seemed engaged. She felt a flicker of hope. The evidence was strong, the testimonies compelling. Yet she knew the defense would do everything they could to sow doubt. As the day's proceedings ended, Eleanor stepped outside the courthouse into the crisp evening air. Jessica joined her, a satisfied look on her face. She told Eleanor that the day had gone well, that the jury seemed receptive. Eleanor nodded, her resolve firm. She glanced toward the horizon, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the city. This wasn't over, but she could feel the tide turning. Justice was within reach. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the final day of the trial began. The gallery was packed, the jury seated in their assigned rows, and the defendants at the defense table looked far less confident than they had at the start of the proceedings. Brian Tanner, his earlier arrogance shattered, stared blankly at the table in front of him. James Foley and Kyle Mercer exchanged nervous glances, while Mick Lewis sat stiffly, his cooperation earning him glares from his former friends. Eleanor sat beside Jessica Nguyen, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had said everything she needed to say, and now it was up to the jury. Jessica had presented the case with clarity and passion, leaving no doubt about the malicious intent of the defendants. The security footage, Eleanor's testimony, and Mick's reluctant confession had painted a vivid picture of the crime. Judge Anita Reynolds called the court to order, her gavel echoing through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" she asked, her tone firm and authoritative. The foreperson stood, a middle-aged woman with a composed demeanor. "We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict," the judge instructed. The foreperson unfolded a piece of paper, her voice clear as she spoke. "In the matter of the state versus Brian Tanner, James Foley, Kyle Mercer, and Michael Lewis, we find the defendants guilty on all charges, including attempted robbery, assault, and intimidation." A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. Eleanor sat still, her face calm, but a deep sense of relief coursed through her. Justice had prevailed. Judge Reynolds nodded solemnly. "Thank you, members of the jury. The court accepts your verdict. Sentencing will proceed immediately." Jessica stood to deliver her recommendation. Your Honor, the prosecution respectfully requests the maximum penalties for Mr. Tanner, Mr. Foley, and Mr. Mercer, given the severity of their actions and the malicious intent behind them. For Mr. Lewis, given his cooperation, we recommend a reduced sentence, but still sufficient to reflect his culpability. The defense attorneys tried to mitigate the damage, each arguing for leniency, but their words rang hollow. The evidence was irrefutable, and the judge's expression remained unmoved as she prepared to issue her decision. "Brian Tanner," she began, her tone measured, "you orchestrated this crime, targeting Mrs. Davis not only for her possessions, but with the belief that her age and race made her an easy victim. Your actions were deliberate and cruel. You are sentenced to 12 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8. Tanner's face fell, his bravado crumbling as the weight of his punishment settled on him. James Foley and Kyle Mercer, the judge continued, you willingly participated in this act, and your behavior escalated the danger to Mrs. Davis. You are each sentenced to 10 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 6 years. Foley let out a shaky breath, while Mercer's head dropped into his hands. The courtroom was silent, the reality of the consequences sinking in. Michael Lewis, the judge said finally, her tone softening slightly. You chose to cooperate with the prosecution and provided valuable testimony that aided in securing these convictions. However, your role as the driver still holds weight. You are sentenced to 5 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 3. Lewis nodded faintly, his shoulders slumping in resignation. He glanced briefly at Eleanor, his lips parting as if to speak. But no words came. Judge Reynolds surveyed the defendants one last time. Your sentences reflect the harm you caused, and the message this court must send, that targeting vulnerable individuals with malice will not be tolerated. This case is adjourned. Her gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into activity. Reporters rushed to capture the reactions, family members exchanged words, and the defendants were led out in handcuffs. Tanner glanced over his shoulder at Eleanor as he was escorted away, his expression a mixture of anger and defeat. Eleanor met his gaze briefly, unflinching, before turning back to Jessica. You did it, Jessica said, her voice warm with satisfaction. We did it. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. Justice was done. That's what matters. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor was met with a group of supporters, neighbors who had followed the case closely. They offered words of encouragement and admiration, though some still seemed hesitant, their discomfort with the situation clear. Eleanor took it all in stride, her focus unwavering. As she arrived home later that day, Duke greeted her at the door with a wagging tail and a joyful bark. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around him. It's over, boy, she murmured. We did it. She stood and walked to the porch, gazing out at her quiet street. The memory of the attack lingered, but so did the strength she had shown, and the justice she had fought for. Duke sat beside her, his head resting against her leg. As the door closed behind her that evening, Eleanor exhaled deeply, the echo of the gavel and the courtroom's tension still lingering in her mind. She set her purse on the counter and looked down at Duke, who sat, waiting patiently, his head tilted, as though sensing her thoughts. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his sturdy frame. It's over, Duke, she murmured, her voice soft. We did it. Justice was served. Duke wagged his tail, leaning into her embrace. His calm presence was a balm to her frayed nerves, a reminder of everything they had endured together. Eleanor straightened and walked into the kitchen, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. Tonight wasn't just about moving forward. It was about acknowledging how far they had come. She prepared Duke's special meal with care, roasting chicken to perfection and adding rice, carrots, and a few of his favorite treats. The smell of the meal filled the air, and Duke sat alert, his eyes locked on her every move. His tail thumped against the floor with eager anticipation. You've been patient, boy, she said, with a small laugh, as she placed the dish on the floor. "Now it's your turn to be spoiled." Duke didn't hesitate, diving into the feast with gusto. Eleanor leaned against the counter, watching him with a smile. Her thoughts drifted to the trial, to the tense moments on the witness stand, and the unwavering strength she had drawn from Duke and her own resolve. The memory of the men's sneers and the fear they had tried to instill in her still lingered, but it no longer had power over her. She had stood firm, fought back, and won. As Duke finished his meal, he padded over to her, his head nuzzling her hand. She knelt again, stroking his fur. "You were my hero, Duke. You stood by me when I needed you the most. I couldn't have done this without you." Eleanor moved to the living room, where the quiet hum of the evening settled around her. She sank into her favorite armchair, gazing out the window at the street bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It was the same street where everything had happened, but tonight it felt different. Calmer, safer, as though the storm had finally passed. Her thoughts turned inward, reflecting on what the ordeal had taught her. The attack had been a painful reminder of the ugliness that still existed in the world, the prejudice and entitlement that emboldened people like those men. But it had also reminded her of the strength within herself, the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. She thought of the trial, of the words she had spoken in that courtroom. They weren't just for her. They were for every person who had been dismissed, underestimated, or dehumanized. The jury's verdict had been a victory, not just for her, but for the idea that people like her mattered, that justice could prevail. Duke nudged her hand again, pulling her from her thoughts. She smiled down at him, his presence a comforting reminder that she hadn't faced any of it alone. He had been her protector, her ally, and her friend through it all. "You deserve a little more," she said, rising and retrieving a new toy she had bought him. A sturdy rope with knots on both ends, something Duke could sink his teeth into without tearing it apart in seconds. She tossed it to him, and he pounced on it with enthusiasm, wagging his tail as he carried it to his favorite spot. Eleanor watched him play, her smile growing. "You've earned that. And so much more, boy." Later, as the evening wore on, she retrieved his leash and opened the front door. The cool night air greeted her, and Duke bounded to her side, ready for their walk. She clipped the leash onto his collar and stepped out onto the quiet street. The neighborhood felt peaceful now, the tension and fear that had once tainted it, now replaced with a sense of calm. The same neighbors who had once turned a blind eye had offered words of support after the trial. Change, Eleanor thought, didn't happen overnight, but it started with small steps. As they walked, Eleanor allowed herself to savor the moment. The stars above seemed brighter, the air crisper. She felt lighter, unburdened by the anger and fear that had clung to her. The journey had been long, but it had taught her something she would carry forever. That standing up to injustice, no matter how daunting, was always worth it. She glanced down at Duke, his ears perked as he trotted beside her. He was more than just a dog. He was her partner in resilience, her steadfast guardian. She reached down to pat his head, her voice soft but steady. "We're going to be just fine, Duke, better than fine." As they rounded the corner and headed back home, Eleanor felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Duke, for the justice system that had worked, and for her own unyielding strength. They had faced darkness together and come out the other side stronger. Tonight, they would rest, but tomorrow, they would wake to a world that felt a little brighter. Together, they stepped into their home, leaving the past behind and embracing the promise of peace. Duke settled into his favorite spot by the couch, his new toy between his paws, while Eleanor sank into her chair with a contented sigh. The battle was over, but the life they had reclaimed stretched ahead of them, full of hope.